So it's a thrill to be with Sylvia Lavin. Sylvia hasn't ever said or written anything that's even half boring. She may aspire to it, but it hasn't happened yet. Unlikely to happen. and it's just really exciting to talk to you about TV. Not that I know what you will say about it, but I just have the feeling that TV crosses the landscape of your work repeatedly, and I don't know whether you have ever kind of pulled it out from the landscape as a thing, or whether it's sort of in there or not. But maybe we could just start with that. Is it true what I'm saying, that you and TV have a kind of relationship?
Well, yes, I have a very strong relationship with TV. Yeah, I suppose it's really the first technology to which that I realize is sort of incorporated in me in some way, in all of us. So it's both the most proximate, but then also therefore the most difficult to manage in some way, because it's everywhere. But TV, I have written about TV in various ways. One indirectly, one very directly. The Castiglioni is about television, very specifically. I don't know if you want to go into these details.
Yes. With Waxman, we're only allowed to go into the details.
The details. Well, yeah. So I'll actually start with Waxman for just a moment. Yeah. In his work on California City, which I came to through California and not through Waxman, and sort of discovered this material and was very astonished at how little work had been done on it. So it's thrilling that you've done this, and was interested in California City, which of course, as you know, turns out to be not a place, but a media broadcasting center.
Right.
So the idea of a city as a broadcast device was, as a form of television, was enormously interesting. And students went off and wrote fabulous dissertations on the subject and so forth. But in trying to get all of this into an exhibition, I looked at a couple of models that Waxman had made for California City, for the big suspended city center. And it was fantastic. It was like peering into the back of a piano while somebody is playing, a Chopin etude. And I realized at that moment, it was sort of the last gasp to understand television as a physical object, as a black box into which, like the screen behind you, a machine that you could enter. And that you were obligated to enter and to understand the modernist myth of transparency, to the point that the box was kind of vomited out its coils and its wires and its cathode ray, and sort of died in the process. It was a kind of it gave up its organs, and that was the end of this model of transparency. So, a few years later, historically, a few years after the California City project, Neutra by then, had spent 20 years thinking about the American domestic landscape.
Right.
And no doubt had not read by then published fabulous essay by Rainer Banham that argues that architects can change the world depending on where they put an electrical outlet, because that will determine where the television set goes.
Right.
And which I thought, was so brilliant. And Neutra designed one of his interiors with the television fixed on a pole, and set up for, that all the photographs by Schulman were staged, and they were largely staged by Neutra. And he sets up this empty room with all of the chairs looking at this television fixed in place. And the television is now not something to be unveiled. It has the guts are irrelevant. Right. It has become the center of a domestic scene.
So but is the TV on in the picture, or is just the TV?
No, the TV is not on.
So instead of watching TV, you're watching the TV.
And there are no people in the picture, they're just
Right.
chairs. So the TV has become a kind of ideal theater. You know,
Right.
it's the stage of an ideal theater, that you're watching the possibility that people could watch
Right.
a television. So
Right.
nothing is actually happening.
Right. I wonder if it's that moment, sort of, maybe we're still in that moment where it would be great if people were as interesting as the TV said. Like, so the TV is with you in the domestic space as a kind of a more ideal companion, like something to talk to, something to listen to. Like, I think there was quite a long period in which people were very careful what they would wear in front of the TV set, because there was a sort of feeling of being with a guest from another place. You know what I mean?
Right,
But
right. As though it could look at you.
Yeah, yeah, and in a sense it does, right? Because if you don't like what you see, they're gonna, in the world we live in, gonna change the program so that we like what we see, so that we shop the way we are supposed to shop, right? So in a certain sense, it is watching us, maybe through ratings and stuff. But what you're saying is amazing, that Neutra would, at a certain moment, it seems like it's a particular moment in his trajectory, that he allows the TV to become a participant in his, little theatrical sets of domestic life. Like you're saying, literally hangs it up on a pole, like I think of a pole dancer or something, like a kind of, maybe that's my problem, a kind of exhibitionism of the TV. It doesn't just sit there as a member of the domestic setup, but it's a kind of thing. It's like the thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because yes, it's late. It's in the 60s, so it's
Right.
you're not going to find that in the earlier works. It's a very strange image, though, not just because the people are absent and this funny theatrical staging, but because it's so fixed. Nothing, that it doesn't really invite changes. It invites a focused attention on this box. So it's not just a guest. It's an important guest. It's a guest that you would reorganize your life around.
Right.
For Neutra, it was all very patriarchal. The newscaster, I suppose, becomes the new figurehead.
So this TV. Of course, the problem with Banham is that he's usually so good, right? It's like annoyingly eloquent, and you said it yourself even more eloquently, that depending on where you could plug in the TV, then domesticity would, as it were, emerge around the TV, so that most of what used to be called architecture could be replaced by a plastic bubble or whatever. You don't really need it, or you need it, like Fuller would argue, just as a sort of minimal shelter from some elements, but mainly you want to receive all this information. You want architecture to bring the world in rather than keep the world out, right? So that even with Neutra, the TV kind of breaks through. I kind of feel like we could write a kind of romantic story about the TV trying to break into architecture, and finally it broke into Neutra relatively late, right? Late in Neutra, but also late in the field. What are some of the other TVs that have intruded on your landscape?
The thing about Neutra that's interesting is that it's so domestic.
Yeah.
And that Banham says this about the plug, but we do have to understand that Banham by then was very Americanized, and his model of domesticity was the model of the American domesticity. So this is one of the reasons I became so interested in Achille Castiglioni, who did a lot of. And this is completely different. There is nothing. I mean, there is something domestic. That there's a fantastic photograph of his workspace in which a television is also on a pole, but behind him. So it's in there. But if you imagine him sitting at his desk, it either works for him like an employee that would sit someplace else, or whispers in his ear, good devil, bad devil. I mean, it's a very interesting thing to have the television be something that you don't look at. But the thing that's interesting about his television work is that it was sustained for 15 years at least, in which he was designing both television boxes, because he was an industrial designer, and so he knew perfectly well that the television belonged to a landscape of new machines that entered the workplace and so forth. but for Castiglioni, that television was a problem of the public. It was not a domestic thing. And so this television is in his workspace, which means that there are other people who are there. And in Italy after the war, people did not have televisions the way they had them in America. They were much fewer, and they were often located in public places like a bar. You know, that you went out into public to watch these things if you were going to. And also, the thing that you were describing, if you don't like this, you change it to that. The choices were extraordinarily limited. So it was not, 2 channels, maybe 3 channels. So you did not go and choose. So the thing that Castiglioni did, and also there's an interesting sort of literature and theory that from the pre-war to the post-war, which means the moment of dealing with fascism and all of those things in Italy, that radio came to be associated with fascism and totalitarianism, and television was the key to a new form of democracy. This is what they said. Part of that was this whole Italian fascination with America after the war, a kind of Americanismo. So that was television. But part of it also had to do with this elaborate didactic infrastructure that Castiglioni came up with year after year, essentially teaching people how to watch TV and teaching people how to manage watching TV. So one year RAI every year did a festival, which included all kinds of exhibitions, and Castiglioni did the RAI television pavilion, let's call it pavilion.
Right.
And each year he tackled a different subject. One year it would be the television calendar. Can you imagine? It's like taking TV Guide. But at a moment you have to understand there were only 3 channels.
Right.
But he has the days of the week, and he tells you which thing is going, and you enter into this ziggurat of a calendar. So he was literally preparing people to now say, Wednesday at 7, I have to be in a certain place to watch such and such. I mean, it was, a total spatial and temporal reorganization of life that Castiglioni was imagining.
I think it's amazing. His work only crossed my landscape. A few years ago, I did a big exhibition called the human insect. Basically the hypothesis was that humans became insects when we invented radio, or when radio invented us at the end of the 19th century, and our antenna were the sort of mark of our insecthood. So I tried to record all of the antenna in architectural projects from then till now, right? And one of them was the Castiglioni Pavilion. Maybe it was from 59 or something, where maybe you remember it. The pavilion is just a kind of Miesian floating plane sprouting like a garden, about 50 different television antenna.
Yes.
But I never went inside. I never looked down below, and I had no idea about this incredibly intimate and innovative relationship that he had with TV, even like in your first image, so beautiful that the TV is sort of whispering advice to him so that he could pass advice to the potential viewer, and especially resonates with Waxman, because Waxman, of course, is also seeing television as a kind of name for some kind of radical democracy. So not I mean, pretty much declaring so upon moving to the United States. So it maybe fits your idea about the American thing, but it resonates also with his thoughts about energy and vibrations and so on in the 20s. But Waxman somehow, if I understand it right, he thinks TV is his sort of word for this better way of being, and he actually never articulates how one would negotiate a relationship with it. So kind of the opposite of Castiglioni, who's kind of designing the relationship. I think Waxman just thinks unbelievably interesting relationships are born of television, and television itself will change and will give birth to other forms of TV. So television is not even a thing like a technology or a particular way of communicating or transmitting, but it's kind of a name for a kind of change. I think that even it's the word for the future for him. So that means that he becomes, he has, on the one hand, television could not be more political because it will be democracy, it will be a new form of interactivity, and new forms of responsibility and so on. It actually never specifies anything about politics, right? So it's kind of like, it's simultaneously quiet about politics and loud. And relative to Waxman, Castiglioni seems much more complex and indeed, I would say, fascinating. I mean, I totally understand how you got hooked.
Well, it's interesting. Just on the bug thing, I have to add. In one of the later ones, it was affectionately called the caterpillar. So because, and this is Castiglioni organizing exactly as you say, he made a series of. He took that same pavilion that you're talking about, took away Mies. And I mean, I think this is important, right? This is the end, just with Waxman, it's the end of a certain fantasy. And also, in my view, and this is, maybe we can get to this with Venturi, it's the end of politics in the abstract, because what you're describing with Waxman is a sense of politics without any details. Right. And without, and that's the Miesian box. So in the 60s, at a certain moment, or early in the 60s, Castiglioni gets rid of that box and starts putting in particulars. And one of the particulars he puts in is news. And he does only this caterpillar thing. It's so now we've taken away the empty politics could be anything. Yeah. And now we start saying politics is about information, because that's what the news is. And he threads people in a box that is elevated off the ground, and it has a series of telescopes, and he's trying to dramatize how news brings information to the viewer from distant places. So inside these things are televisions. And he's trying to explain basically the world geography of news and how it comes together. And the democracy part is, if you're outside of the news information system, in other words, if you're not in his pavilion, you see all the legs moving sideways through this apparatus, and therefore it looks like a caterpillar. And so the humans are engineering this thing. So, I thought it was completely fascinating that he thought that the Italian population that did not traditionally have access to this kind of information during the Second World War, that they needed to be instructed in the new space of global politics that would be the news.
Oh yeah, it's unbelievably interesting. Unbelievably interesting. I mean, the argument of the Human Insect Show was to say that architects are terrified by this insecthood of the human, and so the majority of architects seem to be devoted to concealing that. So, for example, antenna are hidden from publication and discussion. So they're always there, because otherwise there wouldn't be this connectivity that you and I are talking about. But it seems that the antenna has all of the potential to do what architects think that they're doing. It gives you comfort, shelter, connection, connectivity, memory. So basically, there's a kind of jealousy and resentment about antenna. So I became fascinated in whichever architects, at least for a moment, could embrace the antenna, and to see whether, to sort of look at the sort of psychopathology of that. And probably then, that leads us on a path ultimately to Waxman's Civic Center, which is sort of all antenna, and this horizontal plane that is, as you argue, is sort of like the last thing you'll see of Mies before Mies is gone, like it's the end. And a part of this new book is to try to show that it's not just Miesian, but that Mies and Waxman were these drinking buddies in Chicago. And the most sort of most Miesian qualities of Mies are a little bit, in my mind, inseparable from that partnership with Waxman when they were working on projects together and teaching together and criticizing each other. And so part of the misunderstandings of Waxman, I think, come from the fact that precisely because Mies is so celebrated and so kind of universalized in the sense that Mies is everywhere, it's hard to see the radicality of Waxman because we just think, oh, that's Miesian transparency. But I do agree with you. It's exactly what you say. I think that when you enter the Civic Center, well, you don't really enter anything in particular. It's sort of like not really even a building anymore. So if Mies wanted to have almost nothing, this is even less than almost nothing. This is sort of like nothing, or whatever nothing looks like, or whatever architecture looks like just before it disappears. So I think that the idea that an architect could design architecture's exit, like theatrically, like, because you can't just leave, you have to leave, right? There has to be this departure, and that Civic Center somehow captures this departure, and exactly the way I think you say, and say better than me, that that's sort of the end of the transparency thing. Maybe it's because now you're inside information. Well, there's no longer a filter, which puts us right on the edge of Venturi. I'm just dying to hear what you make of Venturi, because again, Venturi scandalized by placing this antenna on this building in Guildhall, precisely for, I would say, because of the fear of the human insect, like the just terror about the architectural force of even a disconnected aerial. I assume it was disconnected, right? Do we know?
Well, so this is the funny story about that, and there are many interesting things about Philadelphia that we have to start with. One is, of course, the history of antennas. So the PSFS building is, there in the middle of everything.
Yeah.
And
you can imagine you can imagine that it was in the exhibition as one of the.
Yes, I'm quite sure. But but that building is almost the apotheosis of a certain kind of celebration of the radio antenna, and at a certain moment they snake a television thing so that it does all of these things. But so Venturi, who is amongst other things and a good observer, certainly was in a kind of dialogue with that antenna at some point. So I decided to look at the archive around Guildhall, and I did not start with the antenna. I just thought to myself, nobody really has said anything interesting about this building that Venturi didn't already say. Right. There must be something else. So one of the things that I discovered was that originally there was a plan that he was full in favor of having a master and visible antenna, and well, connected. So, but this led me to do some research on Philadelphia in the period of Guildhall. So we know that, or I don't think it's in the literature mentioned any place, but in the early 1960s, Philadelphia was at the just as it is today, by the way, in the Trump election, Philadelphia was at the forefront of the politics of race in the United States. Mm-hmm. And one of the first and most significant uprisings was in Philadelphia. And it was a block and a half, literally a block and a half from Guildhall. So if you were, which was under construction. So if you were standing there, you would have been in the middle of all of this. That's number one. Number two, Philadelphia was also known to be a center for independent television channels. So there were the big networks, but there started to be independent channels that had to broadcast on UHF. So there's an aerial problem right there because you need two different antennas for that. But they were devoted to local news. And in the early 1960s, in certain parts of the country, local news meant news of the civil rights actions.
Right.
And the big networks did not want it on the news. They wanted to repress the fact that this was happening. And the local channels, of which Philadelphia was a center, wanted to do it. And then Philadelphia, the region, was also in its last gasp of being industrial part of the Rust Belt, made antennas. There were many, it was the center of antenna production. So in just finding out those three things, to have an antenna or not have an antenna, you know, what an antenna meant, what kind of antenna it was, meant a very racially specific, politically specific set of information questions. That's number one. Number two, television, the quality of the antenna delivered by a building had become a major component of real estate advertising. Mm-hmm. And Guildhall, even though we think of it as a a HUD subsidized housing, which it was, all of those HUD subsidized housings were only partially subsidized, and they were part of a market economy. So they needed to attract tenants.
Right.
And there were other buildings being constructed at exactly the same time. And one of the ways they competed for tenants was through the television delivery system. And it made a huge difference in the value of an apartment, whether you had a direct connection to a master television in the building or whether you had to put an antenna up.
Yeah.
And Venturi got totally entangled in this problem, wanting to supply a master antenna. We know that he said, "Oh, it's really too bad that old people watch television," but he also knew that old people and Black people had the right to news that communicated to them, and he wanted to put a master antenna that would reach each unit. So the master is not the size of the antenna.
Yeah.
It's the quality brought into individual houses, because UHF also, by the way, sorry, I became very entangled in this. I told you, you asked me not to be boring, but Philadelphia, the center of Philadelphia, where all this race action is happening, is surrounded by hills. It's a little bit like the American Rome. It's surrounded by hills, and therefore the quality of the low UHF signal was terrible. So to have a master antenna really meant access to a specific kind of local news, which in the 1960s meant the civil rights movement in the United States. And Venturi fought with the Guild and with the other developers in order to have a master antenna. There was a guy named Marco. He had an antenna making shop. Marco was going to make the antenna. And at a certain point, that he was told that there was simply no budget for it. And you can see in the drawings of the sort of electrical plan that there is introduced the word no during construction in order to save money and essentially deprive the people living there of news. So then it's only after that that there's this big antenna, and he gets told you can't do that either. You can't have an integrated system, nor can we afford a master antenna. And therefore he decided only at that point to essentially represent not television, but his struggle by having this antenna made, which is a compromise between a VHF and a UHF. It combines both.
Yeah.
I mean, it was extraordinary, you know.
So it's totally it's a kind of Venturi neither nor, both and. It looks like that, by the way. It looks like an antenna that's too much of an antenna to be an antenna. So it's a sort of representation. But the story you tell is amazing. And I'm still captivated by Buckminster Fuller's argument that architecture is not built from the ground up, but from the sort of sky down. And in the sort of Fuller way of thinking, you hang a building from the bottom of the antenna, and then it touches the ground. And literally, of course, it should be able to take off again. So in a sense, when you describe the original thought of Guildhall, it is very much connected to the antenna. It is hanging off the antenna, and it is connected to the political landscape, the environment. I mean, it's a kind of environmental thing connected to the environment around. And when they didn't do it in the end, it got disconnected again and sort of returned to architecture business as usual, in which an antenna then becomes seen as a gratuitous and somewhat patronizing gesture. But it starts off, you know, in the kind of full sort of flood of the sort of intravenous logic of information, politics, connection, interactivity, and so on. So it seems to be typical of your research, right? For me, even the word postmodern had become a little bit hard word to encounter because it had been sort of rendered uninteresting by all the people who had used it for a long time. And then your project on the postmodern, of which this antenna plays a key role, right? Just again and again and again flips the script, and you just did it again. So this is what I mean about you lost the boring gene some time ago. but it is, I kind of, in the back of my mind, I was thinking, you showed me a sketch of a Venturi sketch of a TV set with two breasts in it, or is this my fantasy about what I was seeing? So do you have any thoughts about this?
Yes, of course I do. How can you not? I mean, it's the most.
Well, I don't know. There may be some people for whom this produces no thoughts.
No. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. So let me add one thing before I discuss that particular image. So for me, yes, this was a moment in shifting the logic of postmodernism to the issue of postmodernization. So. Right. But Venturi didn't invent postmodernism. He was postmodernized. It happened to him, and this is part of what happened to him. And at that moment, I started to think of this building that he was thinking of the building as itself a communication system. Yeah. And with feeling powerless, he then invents a secondary language in order to deal with this. But for me, this was the first encounter with an architect confronted with the idea that information delivery now was part of the infrastructure. You supply water, you supply heat, and you supply information. And it was not, for me, this was like a radicalization of the problem of architecture from the 60s on. But thinking about this back to Neutra and Banham and the interior, I started looking at the plans of the Venturi. And I realized that the man had probably never watched television, because even though he said that the old people did nothing but watch television, if you looked at the way he actually configured the domestic interiors, there was no logical place to put a television. I mean, he did not understand this at all. So when I came across that sketch, why he's drawing a television, it's just extraordinary. But they're not just breasts. They're modernist breasts. You could absolutely imagine a kind of de Kooning woman around those breasts hanging on the wall of the Museum of Modern Art. So Venturi, the either or the both and has something to do with information and art. And he's trained in the art tradition, let's say the Misesian tradition, of a certain general iconicity. I would say, if you describe the Misesian box as one of those empty icons, the female nude is the painter's version of that in some way. And Venturi, in his brilliance, puts together the box and the nude. I suppose maybe if you ever watched television, it was a PBS show on the history of art or something like that.
It could be the history of the nude. But
the history of the nude.
It's so, again, I love your juxtaposition, or not juxtaposition, but the connection you make. For example, of course, there is always a nude female figure placed somehow. Whatever transparency is, it requires, in its very lightness, requires this very solid stone, seemingly naked figure of a woman, right? So somehow transparency is figured in an unbelievably classical way, of course, going to the connection of the history of the nude rather than naked and all of this. And then Venturi does it as well. I thought you were about to say they're very American breasts, because that would follow from your, sort of burlesque, let's say. So the sort of the forbidden breast. So maybe Venturi doesn't watch TV because it would be like going to the red light district or something. It's really like things happen to you when you go there. And the other thing I was thinking that, when I'm thinking about television and architecture, I always I do a thought experiment. If I remove the TV from somebody's work, does the work change? And if it doesn't change, then I think, well, that TV is not essential to that project. But there are many, particularly in the 60s and 70s, many architects and architectural collaboratives that if you pull the TV out, all the work goes. There's nothing left. You've kind of reversed it on me, because in a way, Venturi, you can't put a TV in there. Like, you know, it's like architects whose work is sort of passively resistant to TV, because you're in a TV time, right? In which, if there is domestic life, it's lived with the TV set. And architects who don't make a place for it, this is a kind of passive resistance to the threat posed by television, which is a sort of a psychosexual threat, right? That everything the architect tries to do, like to draw lines, make distinctions, and so on, provide space, gets subverted and transcended by this super exotic and irresistible information machine, right? Something like this. And you give me the idea of a thought experiment to sort of go and look at the plans of like famous architects. And in the past, I've looked for the TV, but now I'm looking for the impossibility of putting one in there.
Yes, I mean, the plan. So yeah, it's interesting. So either he's resistant, which I'm sure he is,
yeah.
Because of his love-hate relationship with American popular consumer culture, with the pornography of that landscape, because that's the other thing, specific about those breasts is that they're pornographic. They have nipples. They have a lot. They're upright. They have a very specific kind of identity, I guess.
Yeah.
But thinking of the Castiglioni and also the sense of where television is happening, I wonder whether it's also what's the word, a little out of date in the sense that he thinks of the television as a kind of radio, that it's an environment. By now it's everywhere. You don't have to watch it. It's on all the time. So that you could say that the disciplining, I mean, Neutra and Castiglioni, in two very different ways, were disciplining their audience. They were disciplining the subject of architecture to look at television in a certain kind of way. And by Venturi, I think that he doesn't think that discipline is necessary. People are already more expert than he is,
right,
in how to watch television. His job is no longer, it's funny, it makes me think now we could do a comparison plan. We could do Robin Evans, what looks free, what looks disciplined, and to try to make that comparison. In Venturi's fantasy, I suppose, the television is just part of the environment, maybe. I don't know. I love the idea that the big antenna that he put on the roof of the building, in part, to hide the many antennas that were behind it. So it had a camouflage.
Yeah.
It had a camouflage purpose in the end, that it melted. Which is to say, the environment took care of the controversy. And I will at some point find a photograph of the thing crumpling. It always makes me think of the Wizard of Oz and the Wicked Witch that melts when water is poured on her. So it was clear that the rain and the snow were too much for this particular antenna, and it dissolved. Leaving the building in some way, interestingly, the way it would have been had he gotten a master antenna, without the big flourish on the top.
Right. I always say, I mean, for sure, the antenna is both wicked and kind of and witchly.
And witchy, yeah.
yeah. So it's just, and I think that, and architects are in general, if we can speak in general, but I think that's all we can do, probably speak in general. Architects are caught between, are fearful of being bewitched by this antenna. Something that strikes me about our conversation is, maybe because we have so many interests in common, but the Guildhall is 65.
Yeah, 64.
And the Neutra image was 66, or
you know, I would have to check. Let's
somewhere in there,
something like that. Yeah,
something like that. The Banham text of "The House Is Not a Home" is more or less the same.
Yeah,
something like this.
Yeah,
the Civic Center, you know. So all of these things that we've discussed, which are in California and in New York and in Milano and in Philadelphia, we are talking about all projects that are done in 2 or 3 years of each other, all connected by way of our conversation with questions of media, also questions of politics, local and global, and also local TV, global TV. It's all a particular moment. So there's a sort of a sort of moment, not normally positioned as coming after sort of heroic modern and before, you know, something else. And it is also a moment in which maybe there's a sort of the radicals will flourish soon, like very quickly. And for them, TV will be everything and Waxman will be everything. And then there's an alternative path. And somehow architecture went back from the alternative path. And all of these stories got buried, it seems to me. And you have so beautifully made the antenna on Guildhall into a kind of protagonist. She's a diva in architectural history, and I cannot express more kind of selfish gratitude, because I just love the thought that the bewitching antenna, which sort of literally stands at the intersection between the physicality of the building and information. It is the piece of the physical world, the kind of wire with which the ethereal information will kind of come into the domestic space. So it's really the real facade of the building, or the real exterior of the building, or the real limit. I mean, if architects are into what's in, what's out, well, the antenna is the one sort of sitting right there at that very sensitive, almost we could say erotic point, you know, this sort of aperture to the other. And the neglect of this relates to the neglect of certain figures and certain concepts. And I see all of your work as having lifted those figures and those concepts sort of up for view, and then sort of turn them around a little bit. And then things don't go back to where they were before. And this is, I think, it's amazing when scholars can do that, and you do that all the time. So that's why it was fun. You know, it's always fun.
Well, it's super fun. And I guess I would just, I would say for me, it was, you know, going back to the early literature on the Guild Hall.
Yeah.
Which, this is, again, not just about what is postmodernism and why should we bother with that term, but which I think is an important question. But you know, Venturi is the first. You'll correct me if you think I'm wrong, but he's the first architect of a period, including the radicals, in which their own discourse about their own buildings so filled the information channels that there was not room for other things. So the aphoristic, telegraphic form of architectural discourse that I think of as having been supremely designed by somebody like Auguste Choisy, who in an axonometric drawing and in 3 words could change the world, read closely by Mies and Le Corbusier, etc. This aphoristic way of speaking with a few words is like the empty hall. It's politics as generality. And with Venturi, you get an excess of words. It's not just that the buildings pretend to be about words, but you get an excess of words, and it absolutely limited. There was no space in that information environment for any kind of critical discourse. So one person after another, who all knew Venturi well, who asked him questions, all told the same story about the antenna. I mean, for 20 years, they repeated the story that Venturi told them. And this was that the antenna was conceived as a work of art. It was always a work of art. And I'm I'm as an architect, I belong to a certain class of architects because I think about it this way. And the word that they used repeatedly was, well, the facts of the case. I was completely fascinated. And so I realized that today when we think about making history, we have returned, unlike the period of let's call it a postmodern historiography, which was all about projection of meaning and interpretation of meaning and meaning and meaning and meaning and meaning. We are now finally finding room, not big spaces, but in the little spaces where those facts, like the bill to the guy that made the original antenna, that empirical landscape is what is needed to kind of get through the excess of words that somebody like Venturi spread through the field.
Well, I think this is an incredibly eloquent way to end the conversation, and it resonates very strongly, I think, for me, what you're saying, that there is this whole several generations even of communication experts that portrayed architecture as itself a form of communication, but they themselves were very resistant to alternatives to their own voices, and almost as if they were fearful of their own theory. Like if they stopped talking, something else would happen. And the weird thing is, I suppose weird, but a lot of the story was really accurate. Like a lot of the sort of portrayal of the world of information and so on was sort of super accurate. But the stories about the individual projects are super inaccurate. Partly also this book on Waxman tries to take a number of stories that Waxman repeated thousands of times with a very particular error strategically built into the story that gets faithfully repeated. And then the question is, why? Like what, and I think once again, some of these writers are just nervous, and others are really, really good. Like they know not to let another voice in. It would be an idiot that would not let your voice in. Thanks. It was great.
Always fun to talk to you.
Likewise.
I'm now going to try to think about the history of architecture during that period as the difference between architects that tried to become major networks, and architects that wanted to operate through UHF local channels.
Perfect. There's a project. Bye, Sylvia.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.